Welcome to Books of Our Time, brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book called The Price of Defiance, James Meredith and the Integration of Ole Miss. The book takes an exhaustive look at the history of racism at Ole Miss prior to 1962 and to the events surrounding the matriculation of the school's first black student. With me to discuss his book is its author, Charles Eagles, a professor of history at the University of Mississippi. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Charles, thank you for coming. I say that to everybody, and most of them have come all the way from Boston or New York or maybe Washington, but you're from Mississippi, and so that's a much further trek. As a lot of Boston men found out back in 1863 or something like that.
Right. Well, thanks for having me.
Tell the audience, if you would, in broad terms, what the book is about.
The book is about the integration of the university, and most people assume that will focus almost exclusively on James Meredith and his enrollment there in the fall of 1962. What I wanted to do, though, was to explain how and why that happened, when it did, and where. As I've told people on a number of occasions, for most of us, the riot accompanying his enrollment and his appearance there appears like a mushroom. It just out of nowhere. And what I wanted to do is set it in a context and explain why it happened. And what I found very quickly was that events at the university over the last decade and a half had prepared the way for it. A series of controversies and crises dealing with race and the university and involving state politics too. So I wanted to set the context. I also wanted to examine James Meredith as a person, as an individual, and explain who he was. I think I wanted to try at least to do it better than others had done. Yeah. And lastly, I wanted to follow his year at the university until he graduates in the following August of '63, which no one had ever done. So I think those are the three main things I hope to achieve.
Why did you want to do those things? I mean, what put you up to it, or who put you up to it, or what got you interested in doing those things?
Well, virtually all of my scholarly work has dealt with Southern race relations and the Civil Rights Movement. And at the University of Mississippi, where I've been since 1983, the topic is James Meredith and the integration of the university in 1962.
Still?
Still what?
You said the topic.
Oh, it was when I was there, yes, when I first went there in '83. It had been a topic of conversation, I think, at lots of parties and cocktail receptions and things for the previous 10 years, or 15 years after the riot itself, as people just kind of constantly talked about it and rehashed it and told stories. And so you couldn't go there in 1983 without knowing that that was the place where it happened. And after I'd been there a few years, I was approached and asked if I wanted to do a book, and I was told that an administrator had, not as part of his job, I suppose, but just as a sidelight, had been collecting a lot of university documents dealing with it, and that he would make it available to me if I wanted to do that. And so the opportunity to write on an important topic using documents that no one had ever seen becomes very appealing. And I had just finished another project, my last book. So
you were right. Mm-hmm. We have once before, early on in the history of this program, had somebody on with a similar kind of story to tell, so to speak. He was a doctor at the Yale Medical School who wrote a book on anti-Semitism at Yale. And they opened the archives to him. That was the point of comparison in my mind. Mm-hmm. And people were just shocked by what he came up with. It was really one of the first times that the history of anti-Semitism in the 1920s and 1930s throughout the American educational system was written about. And I take it from things you've said to me that people were quite shocked by what you found in the archives and elsewhere with regard to Ole Miss.
Well, I think a lot of people had just not heard the full story. No one had No one had looked particularly at the background to the riot. And so people who had lived there or grown up there, there were parts of the story that completely surprised them. No one, I think, knew fully the story about segregated athletics at the university, for instance. Athletics had been segregated there by unwritten law, from soon after the Brown decision through Meredith's enrollment. And the impact that had on baseball teams and basketball teams and football teams, no one had really been fully aware of.
I find that really remarkable. Of course, I have to say, as Cassie Stengel once did, most people my age are dead at the present time. So I shouldn't find it remarkable that so many people don't know about that. But I do, because that, the 1950s, under a football coach named Johnny Vaught, was, I think, the halcyon days, as they say, of University of Mississippi football. And also, Mississippi had good basketball teams at Mississippi State and Mississippi Southern, and yet these kids could not play in national tournaments against any of the other schools in the country for fear that, heaven forfend, they might play against African-American players.
That's right, that's right. And I even talked to a couple of people who were on those teams, and they did not realize, or maybe didn't want to admit later on, a generation later, that that is the reason they did or did not go to a particular bowl game or did not participate in the College World Series in baseball. But it was a topic of pretty intense discussion in the mid and late 1950s and early 60s.
What did you do besides mine the archives by way of research for this book?
Well, you have to be obsessive, I suppose, to do good research.
I had no question.
You just follow every possible lead. I'll give you one example. The Center for Military History of the United States Army, they write histories of Army involvements in various things, or various battles in World War II or Vietnam, or various aspects of the Army involvement. Well, the Army was involved in integrating the university because the President sent units of the Army there. So there is a written history of the Army's involvement at the University of Mississippi in 62, 63. Well, that's fairly well known. A man named Paul Shipes wrote it, never published, but it's available in manuscript. Well, then I discovered...
Can I interject something?
Yes.
Explain very briefly, because we'll get to it later on, why the Army was involved and how it was involved.
The Army was involved because the President sent United States Marshals in to ensure Meredith's safe enrollment September 30th, October 1st, 1962. And a riot ensued, and federal forces had to be called in to restore peace and order and ensure his safety there. But the Center for Military History then has a history of that involvement. What I discovered is that Paul Shipes, the man who wrote that history, had had free access to government documents in doing his research. And instead of doing what most historians do, taking notes on the documents, he simply took the documents. That was just the way they operated. And so there is a record group at the National Archives that contains all of his documents, or at least a fair percentage of them. Nobody's ever looked at those. Well, it's important to then go behind him and look at the actual documents and not just use what he got out of those documents. So that was one example. Another example, well known at the time, there was a legislative investigation of the riot by the Mississippi legislature. A committee called the General Legislative Investigating Committee held hearings, had witnesses, and issued a report. Well, I was curious to know where those records were. So I tracked them down, and finally found them in the State Records Center and got access to them. I am the only person who's ever seen them, and I think they probably are still closed to everybody. I got them through people I knew and the head of the successor agency. So you just, and hundreds of pages of testimony about the riot. Contemporaneous testimony.
Now you were writing, you wrote this book in the 90s, as I understand it, and the early part, first 6 or 7 or 8 years of the 21st century. When you started, I would guess that the events of those days was somewhere about 30 to 35 years in the past. Mm-hmm. And then when you were finished, it's probably more like 40 to 45 years in the past. But a lot of people were still alive who played a role or were at least on the scene. Did you interview a lot of them, and what, if so, what kinds of roles and so forth had they played?
Well, you're asking about oral history.
Or your interviews.
Yeah,
yes.
Right. Interviews, I don't know how many I did, probably 50 or 60, fewer than 100 for sure. I found very quickly that the interviews were not all that helpful because the stories had been told and retold, and many of the things became confused in people's minds about whether they actually saw it, heard it, or heard a story about it later. Some of the interviews were helpful, but I did not rely on interviews as much as I have in earlier works, primarily because the written record is so rich. Right. FBI records, I got, you asked about research earlier, I was the first person to get access to all the FBI records dealing with this case. I think I'm, to this date, still the only person who's seen the marshal's accounts. Their daily, almost hourly reports during the time they were at the university.
How has the book been received, say, at the university, in Oxford, in Mississippi, in the South, in the North, each of those various places? I mean, I presume it's not the same everywhere.
I don't know. We'll have to wait on everywhere to get reviews in some of the scholarly journals. I can tell you anecdotally that the people I've talked to in Oxford who've read it, it's been an overwhelmingly positive response. My wife and I thought when I started working on this in early 1990s that we would have to leave the state of Mississippi when it came out. We have not had to. In fact, some of the people who were actually involved at the university were students there and knew many of the people who were mentioned in the book have told me that they thought I got it right. One particular person told me that it had been a painful experience to read the book, but that I had gotten it right. My description of the university, my description of the chancellor at that time, and other figures. So it's been much more positive than I had at one time feared. The only review nationally that it's gotten so far was on something called History News Network, an online resource for historians primarily, I suppose. And a professional historian reviewed it there, and I treasure one of his sentences, which was, there wasn't an extraneous sentence in the book. Yeah. Which meant that it wasn't padded or...
Right, and that's meaningful, particularly because there are a lot of sentences in that book.
Yes.
There's a lot of, as you point out at lunch, it's easy to keep track of the facts, but there are a lot of facts in the book, which is a reflection of the thoroughness of the research. Have you had, I think you have said to me that a lot of people were amazed, people in the South, were amazed at what had gone on at the University of Mississippi. I guess being an ahistorical country, and I presume that there must be under 50 or so, I mean, they just apparently had no idea about any of this.
A lot of people didn't, and a lot of people did not know a lot of the kind of backstories that were going on. Yeah. And I think the book is not aimed, though, just at a Southern audience. I hope that people who have no connection with the South, know about the South but have not lived there or grown up there, will read the book and get great insight into what life was like in the 1950s and 60s in the South. Yeah. How segregation worked, what life was like, and how white supremacist ideas permeated many aspects of Southern life.
You sent me an email which said that you find, or were afraid you would find, that one of your most difficult tasks is to explain to Northerners who have not reached my ripe age and therefore were not alive when this happened, what it was like in the South at the time. So why don't you hold forth on that a little bit, if you would?
Okay, well, but first of all, I hope what the book does is not just tell people that it was a bad place, for instance, but instead of telling them that kind of thing, show them through examples, through those facts, through a whole range of stories about different topics.
The novelist technique, actually.
Well, I don't claim to be a novelist.
No, I understand, but that is the novelist technique.
Yes, a narrative technique,
Yeah.
which I think is an historian's technique.
Yeah, okay.
At least it should be.
Okay.
So what I think comes out in the book is that race affects at the university and in Mississippi, and I think we could probably generalize with some confidence about other parts of the South. Race affects nearly every aspect. It affects, as we said, athletics. It affects academic freedom. It affects religious activities on campus. It affects entertainers and social life on campus. It affects employment patterns and who works at the university and how they interact. So I think it reveals that segregation affected everything and wasn't limited to politicians and judges and courts, but affected day-to-day life and for most whites.
You know, I once interviewed for 2 hours at Duke John Hope Franklin about his book called Mirror to America, which I believe was his last book.
Autobiography.
Autobiography, yeah. And he said when he went to take, I believe it was the graduate record exam or one of those exams that you take to get into graduate school, he was to take it at Vanderbilt, which is northern Tennessee, but still the South. And as he was walking down around the campus, he would see African-American groundskeepers. And they could tell that he was going to do something academic, because I don't know, he's carrying a briefcase. And you know, their jaws dropped 3 feet. Symptomatic of what you're talking about. And when he got into the room, the proctor, who was a professor, asked him what he's doing there. And he said, I've come to take the test. I threw the test on the floor. And that's just a little bit of an example. He told another example. I'm telling some of these because it helps put flesh on the thing. When he was a little boy, I guess he was growing up in Oklahoma, there was a blind woman who was trying to cross a busy boulevard. And he said he'll help her. And so she took, he's a little 10-year-old kid, 11-year-old kid, took her hand, and he walked across the street with her. And somehow in the middle of the street with traffic whizzing around, she said to him, in effect, are you black or are you white? And he said, I'm black. Threw down his hand, blind, traffic everywhere. and negotiated it on her own. This stuff is just unbelievable.
Well, your blind story reminds me of the person at the university named Blind Jim Ivey, who was a black man who was blinded in an accident in the 1890s and started working on campus, not for the university, selling peanuts and candy to students. And he became known as Blind Jim, and a very respected figure on campus. Students sort of adopted him, and he became what he called himself was the dean of freshmen, because he kind of took the freshmen under his wing and gave them advice and tried to help them. But all this was in a very paternalistic relationship. And what Blind Jim did was work on the campus, and it, in many ways was part of the campus, but not really part of the university. And the students took care of him. They were very affectionate. He went to sporting events and cheered for the Rebels and went in parades with them in town and that kind of thing. But he was still an African American. Now, what I think is interesting about compare your blind story and Blind Jim's story, the fact that Blind Jim is blind helped him survive on the campus, because he was not seen as a threat. Blind people are often pitied by sighted people, and so he is pitied now for being blind and for being black. And he's seen as harmless because he is, by the 1940s and 50s, old and blind, so he cannot even do the taboo thing of looking at white women, the white female students. So he's safe. But he plays a significant role in the life on the campus. Now, he dies in the mid-50s, soon after the Brown decision, and there is some reason to believe that attitudes had hardened after the Brown decision and that whites were treating him less respectfully. Some of the white students were. So perhaps he was becoming an anachronism after Brown, and his function could only be served under segregation.
You said a couple of times just now that there was nothing to fear. What was the fear held by white people? And in return, what was the fear held by black people? And I mean, I read a lot in the book about so-called mongrelization.
Well, the fear on the part of white people, I think, the fear came in two parts. One is the fear of the unknown. And by that I mean they are comfortable with a system of segregation and are comfortable with a system of white supremacy. And if that changes, they don't know what's going to be next. And that is really frightening to people, not to know what's going to replace what is, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, a stable system, the Southern way of life, they call it. If that changes, what's going to replace it? And that's a real gamble, and most people are not willing to risk changing something that fundamental to their way of life. So that, in a general sense, I think we always have to keep in mind. They did not know what was going to be next. More specifically...
Can I?
Yes.
And then we'll go back to the more specifically. I mean, this kind of fear, as I understand it, goes back, I don't know how you pronounce Toussaint Louverture, but the man who successfully rebelled against Napoleon, which was hard to do. It was an African-American rebellion in Haiti, and they killed all the whites. And that became, throughout the early 19th century, that became a major fear down south, led to patrols and God knows what all, hardening of the attitudes towards slavery. But there seems always to have been this fear on the part of white people of change and of what happens if, first, if you do away with slavery, and later if you do away with Jim Crow.
I think that's right. I was making a more general point, though, that I think it may be part of, if we have something called human nature, that we just fear the unknown. But now when race is involved, yes, it becomes all the more threatening to whites in the South, and particularly in places where there is a sizable or even a black majority, then there is just fear in numbers. More specifically, I think the fear was that somehow blacks would be uncontrolled, particularly black men, and that white women needed to be protected from black men. This fear of miscegenation, the fear that the white race would no longer be pure, that just drove lots of people to do what we now would see as kind of extreme things to protect segregation. And the real irony here is that as someone, I think it's in the book, at least I've read, that someone says, well, what's the matter? Do you fear that your white daughter will not know how to deal with black men? Do you actually fear that she will be attracted to black men? So the fear is maybe that white women would find them irresistible. But it's always couched in terms of the threat that black men would pose.
How about from the African-American standpoint? You make the point several times in the book, just like you make the point about the white fear of miscegenation. You make the point, and in fact it's very prominent at the very end of the book, that black people lived in utter fear for their lives in the South for 90 years or so.
Well, for more than that, all through slavery. They had no way legally to protect themselves. And the legal system was controlled by whites. So if a lynch mob gathered, what could blacks do?
Yeah.
The sheriff could be there and later would say the lynching was conducted by persons and parties unknown.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there would be people, they didn't have masks on, they were clearly visible, but nothing was ever done. So they had to live in fear. And not just fear of lynching, but fear of losing their jobs, fear of losing housing, all kinds of fears. One story I tell in the book, for instance, a black employee at the university in the 1950s, was summertime. All the students were virtually gone and they were working in a deserted dorm doing repairs, and it was hot. And he decided that he would just go over and get a drink out of the water fountain. Well, his supervisor berated him, threatened to fire him because he drank out of a white water fountain. And blacks weren't supposed to do that. So there were these constant worries that they would somehow violate the line between the races and face some kind of retribution. Whether it be physical or economic, it didn't matter. It could be potentially very severe.
Yeah. But didn't you tell me when you yourself arrived at the university in Oxford in 1883, you noticed and your wife noticed that when you'd walk through the square, even as late as 1983, African-American people would avert their eyes because lest it be considered a challenge somehow.
We noticed that that was much more common than where we came from. And it startled us, in fact. And I think I also told you that one of the great changes, I think, in the last quarter century is you don't notice that nearly as much as you did in the early 80s.
Yeah.
And that would have, in 1983, that would have primarily been older blacks who had grown up in that system and still behaved that way. And as those people, as we earlier talked to, as those people, white or black, or white and black, die out, those old patterns are going to become less prominent, and newer ways are going to.
I should tell the audience, I guess, that we were discussing the concept of generational change.
Yes.
And that in science and in law and a whole host of fields in everyday life, things change when the old generation dies. Mm-hmm. And that, if memory serves, I was once with Robert Maynard Hutchins when somebody asked him at his center in Santa Barbara, how do you get change? And his answer was, roll up the hearses. Mm-hmm. So that... and
let me just give you an example of generational change. Students I taught in 1983 at the university were the children, if their parents were, say, 25, they were the children, 25 when they were born. 83, they were born in, do the math with me, 65. Their parents would have been born then in 1940.
Yeah.
Do the same thing now, and it's going to be 25 years later. I'm now teaching the students whose parents did not grow up in a segregated system.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it changes what you know and how you think about things.
Yeah. Yeah. And when, like most of America, you don't know history, I mean, this stuff to me, I grew up with it because I can remember when Emmett Till was killed and, et cetera, et cetera. Well, but the people who don't read history and are in their 20s or 30s, hey, this is like, what do they say, the past is a foreign country?
Mm-hmm. Well, and Emmett Till was just a half a dozen years before James Meredith.
That's right.
And Bilbo died only 15 years before James Meredith entered the university. So the people who were dealing with James Meredith in the Board of Trustees or the university, or the adults, they knew Bilbo.
Yeah. Now tell people who Bilbo was.
Well, he was a governor of Mississippi and senator in the 1930s and 40s who was, I don't like to use the word racist particularly. I think it's too powerful a term, but I think he was a racist and made outrageous claims against blacks and wanted total and complete segregation.
Yeah, yeah. He was an infamous character.
Oh, yes.
At the time and in American history. One thing that, to go from the, like the world shaking and the overarching to something that's really small, but in its own way very funny when you think about it. It's so perverse. I always thought, as probably has most of America, that the name for the university, Ole Miss, is derives from the fact that in the South they tend to drop the last consonant in words like old. And so you get Mississippi, so you get Old Mississippi. That's not what it's from. Explain what it's from.
Well, you think it would be spelled O-L apostrophe miss. That would be what you would assume.
That's true.
But it in fact is O-L-E-M-I-S-S.
Yeah.
Well, the origin of the term is really, the ultimate origin is unknown. But it seems the best explanation is that Ole Miss derives from the slave term for the plantation mistress. And the plantation owner, the man, would have been called Old Massa, and the plantation mistress, the white head of the plantation, would be known as Ole Miss. And so Ole Miss, which is the term associated with the University of Mississippi, is in fact a black term for the plantation mistress, which the ironies of the school adopting a term that comes from the black dialect is
well, yes, that's one great irony. But you know, there has been so much change in Mississippi. Maybe you could sort of the next order of business hold forth on the change, but there's been so much change in Mississippi, and they don't use the Confederate flag anymore, and they don't have a Colonel Rebel anymore, I guess, and this and that. Hasn't anybody ever raised Cain about the fact that the school is called Ole Miss?
Some of us have objected to it. It is so deeply ingrained in tradition there that it probably is going to remain. Yeah. I think, like we were saying, generational changes. I think a lot of the people at the university now have no idea what the term means or where it came from. Even black students would defend Ole Miss as a nickname for the university. So I'm not sure it's going to, it'll be around a while. I think what some people want to do, though, is emphasize University of Mississippi as much as possible. I always tell people I teach at the University of Mississippi. I don't tell people I teach at Ole Miss. I don't generally use the term.
It's not a Norwegian name.
No, it's not. That's right.
Would you explain a little bit?
I don't think there are any Norwegians in Mississippi to any great extent.
And there are no Mississippians in Norway.
Probably fewer.
Would you explain a little bit about the role that prior to 1962, maybe even unto today, I don't know, that the University of Mississippi plays in the state and in the media and as part of the establishment?
Well, for people who have not been to Mississippi, need to realize that there, except for Jackson, Mississippi, the capital, there is not any place in the state that most people would recognize as an urban area. And in the 1950s and 60s, it was common to say the two main cities in Mississippi were Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana. And in fact, papers from Memphis in northern Mississippi and the New Orleans paper, the Times-Picayune, in southern Mississippi had quite a circulation. So there really weren't any cities. There were towns. And so much of the entertainment or cultural or medical even centers that we attach to cities simply didn't exist in the state. And so Mississippi, the University of Mississippi, fulfills a function that in other areas would be covered by cities. For instance, basketball and football games, particularly football, were big social events at the university. People from around the state would come, and the ones who couldn't come would listen on the radio or television when it was televised. Happenings on the campus were regularly publicized in the Jackson newspapers. Student body elections were written about in the Jackson paper. Fraternity and sorority pledging was often reported in the paper.
The Greek system was a huge deal.
Yes, yes. And the student body elections, other things going on the campus regularly made the papers, because that was where a lot of things were happening. Right. There wasn't much happening in the rest of the state.
Right.
And it also was important because the leadership of the state, the elite, many of them sent their sons and daughters to the university to be educated. And they were there, in part at least, as a socializing experience, to meet husbands and wives, many of them then to go to law school. And once they went to law school, they were automatically, you as a lawyer will appreciate this, if you graduate from the University of Mississippi Law School, you do not have to take the bar exam. You were automatically admitted to the bar. And so if you were going to be a politician, it was advantageous to go at least to the law school.
Yeah.
So the university and the law school controlled the bar. They controlled, I don't mean the Alumni Association did, but their alumni were influential and controlled virtually all aspects of the state.
Yeah. I mean, I got the impression that in effect the university was a finishing school for the establishment in Mississippi.
Oh yes, that's what many people refer to it, as a country club for the elite and finishing school.
And the only other thing that's worth mentioning is they were huge into the Miss America pageant, and I think won twice in the 50s, and that was a tremendous big deal in those days.
Yes, it was, and it just confirmed the image of the university as the place for powerful football teams and beautiful girls.
Yes, indeed.
Sports Illustrated referred to it as babes and brutes.
Now, simultaneously from what you say, which I must say feeds the prejudices of Northerners at the time, the university did not much strive for nor attain intellectual distinction, and the society and the university were sort of closed societies where one dasn't dissent. Mm-hmm. So that, you know, people like, for example, James Silver, and you might talk a little bit about James Silver because he's an individual whom I've heard of for years, long before I read The Price of Defiance. People like James Silver who dissented on, with regard to the New Deal, he was a university professor, with regard to the New Deal, with regard to race, why they were virtually run out of state on a rail more than once. Mm-hmm. And having gone through that in Kansas, I'm sympathetic with it. But wanted to describe Silver and what all that meant.
I think what you started off with was the nature of the university in the 1950s and early 60s. And this is something that a couple of people have bristled at, but I think in the first chapter I portray it as really a very mediocre university. They admitted students who perhaps were not overly qualified for college. They had to do that in order to get state funding, state appropriations. The faculty was not the strongest. But this was a time when I think if we looked, a lot of state universities in the United States were mediocre. Yeah. In fact, I think maybe the definition of mediocre is average. And so
I have to tell you that Sputnik had a phenomenal effect on state universities.
Yes, it did.
The money started pouring in and they started improving like you wouldn't believe.
That did, and then the baby boom arriving in the early mid-60s for the first time. It increases the funding and the enrollment and everything. But I think the university was isolated. It was provincial. It was in a society that did not encourage free thought, because if you get people thinking, they may think about the race question, and if they begin to think about that, they may question segregation, and that would have been a taboo. So once you close down thinking on one part of life, it tends to stultify general.
Not terribly different from what people thought about Soviet Russia. Mm-hmm. You must shut off the thinking, because boy, once you let people start thinking, that'll be the end.
Right, right. And a number of people have, observers at the time, compared Mississippi in the 1950s and early 60s to totalitarian societies. I think that's a little excessive, but it certainly gives some idea of the level of repression for whites and blacks in the state. Now, as for Jim Silver, he was an American historian, taught American history, went there in the mid-late 1930s after getting a PhD at Vanderbilt, and taught there until the early 60s, mid-60s. From early on, he was outspoken. That's just the nature of who Jim Silver was, I think. And he was willing to raise questions that other people didn't. He spoke out for labor unions, for instance, in a state that had virtually no labor unions and were certainly not receptive to unions. He defended the New Deal, defended Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt at a time when many people saw them as leading us to socialism or communism and interracial mongrelization. He was very active in bringing controversial speakers to campus. throughout the 40s and 50s. And because of that was sort of a lightning rod. But the interesting thing about Silver is that he also performed important functions within the university, and he had, I think, a good relationship with the chancellor. And so he was able to hold on to his job, even though people were attacking him in the press and challenging him and questioning him. And he sought that too. He spoke to Rotary clubs and Kiwanis clubs across the state. He was out much more than most academics are in speaking his mind and trying to educate the public. So if he was a lightning rod, it's partially because he was up in the sky looking for lightning. He did eventually get in trouble, though, in the early 60s when Meredith enrolled in 1962. Silver was on leave, but he was in residence at the university, and he befriended Meredith and became, I think, a confidant of Meredith's, played golf with him and talked to him frequently, had coffee in the Union.
Yeah.
And
but even Silver could not bring Meredith to his own home because Silver's wife was an Alabama girl, as I remember.
That's right.
And would have no truck with this.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he had to defer to Mrs. Silver's wishes on that.
One of the interesting sidelights of all of that is that a lot of people in the state hated Silver, not only because he was a communist and against racial discrimination, but because of his last name, they thought he was Jewish. And he actually came from a huge, long line of Yankees.
That's right. That's right. And of course, we never can know for certain, but I've checked as much as I could, and I've asked two of his children, and they said absolutely not. No, nothing Jewish in the family. And of course, his middle name is Wesley, which is not a common Jewish name as far as I know.
It'd be Methodist.
Well, I think it might tend to be. Yeah.
Except it's a very common name in general.
Yeah.
At the time, Medgar Evers was a major figure in Mississippi, and he ultimately got shot.
Mm-hmm.
But he worked a little bit with Meredith to encourage him or something.
Yes.
Why don't you tell a little bit about what Evers did?
Medgar Evers became the head of the NAACP in Mississippi in the mid-50s and had that role, full-time employee of the NAACP, when Meredith returned from his Air Force duty in 1960, 59-60. And while Meredith was a student at Jackson State, he got to know Evers, and Evers advised him and helped him and encouraged him in his activities. When Meredith wrote off to apply to the university in January of 1961, Evers is one of the people he then talked to about that later, and Evers was one who helped get him in touch with the NAACP lawyers and secure counsel for him. And they stayed in close touch throughout James Meredith's year at the university. There is a picture in the book of Evers and Meredith at a press conference in January of 1963. So they became, I think, close. And when Evers was killed in the early summer of 1963, Meredith is devastated by it, disturbed, and issues a press statement that gets him in a little bit of hot water because he deals with the press when he shouldn't have.
Yeah. You know, Meredith is one of the all-time gutsy guys. And in 1966, he went back to Mississippi, as I remember it from the book, and did a walk against fear, I think it was called. He was walking from, I don't know, Jackson to Oxford or something.
Well, Memphis, he was going to go from Memphis to Jackson.
Memphis to Jackson. And his friend had been killed, and he got shot.
Yes, yes, and survived.
Yeah.
But yes, he was a gutsy guy. Yeah. And I think that people need to remember that in doing what he did in 1961 and 62 to gain admission. It took a phenomenal resolve and dedication and commitment. And a weak person could not have done that.
No way, no way. A strong person could not have done it. It took somebody who was almost, convinced to the point of, I don't know what the word is exactly, but convinced almost to the point of fanaticism that it had to be done.
Well, and he thought that more than once said he thought he had a divine mission to do it.
Yes.
A divine mission.
Yes.
And he also viewed himself as a soldier.
Yes.
Who had been assigned this task or had assumed the responsibility to do it, and he was going to see it to the end.
Let me come back to that in a minute, because I want to lead up to it just a bit by asking you, what was the reaction in the state it would be 8 years previously, when Brown versus the board came down? Probably the most consequential opinion of the 20th century, maybe of the country's history.
Mm-hmm.
What was the reaction in the state?
Thought it was devastating. Thought it was a violation of every principle they knew. One local judge wrote a pamphlet called Black Monday. This was evil and awful and could not be allowed to happen. And soon after the May 17 decision, whites in the state began to organize the Citizens Council to resist the Brown decision. And a year or so later, the state established the State Sovereignty Commission to, in effect, police the racial barrier between blacks and whites. So it reacted very strongly. I think many whites may have been in disbelief too that this could ever change, but this threatened at least one of the fundamentals of their way of life, and they simply could not tolerate that.
I have long thought, Jim, and I'm asking your opinion about this because I might be out of my gourd, as they say. I have long thought that one of the great mistakes in Supreme Court history was when Felix Frankfurter persuaded the court after the first Brown decision to rule in the second Brown decision that integration would occur with all deliberate speed instead of immediately. And as people who run corporations like Louis Gerstner, when he changed IBM, can tell you, when you're going to change a culture, do it instantly. Don't give people a chance to organize, to start raising the holy dickens about it. To say, this is it, it's going to change. Now, you know, one could say against my opinion, well, Larry, that's just insane. You would have had a war. To which I would reply, well, not if the federal government had, which I think it would have been forced to, send in troops. It would have been a very short war. They lost one already. They were not going to get very far with this one.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on what I think is my far-out idea?
Well, first of all, I guess historians don't deal in counterfactual evidence, so it's kind of
lawyers do.
yeah. It's kind of tricky. I think the main problem with all deliberate speed is not that it wasn't a very quick and clean and abrupt change in the culture, as you say, but that there was no end in sight. In other words, there's a difference between having it occur on May 18th and having it say it's got to occur by a date certain.
So if we can postpone this, we can stall it, we can keep the game
That's
going.
right. If we can just keep putting it off, maybe they'll forget about it, something else will come up, or they will lose interest, or whatever.
Yeah.
This happened after the Civil War, after all. It
yes.
just postponed it, and we wound up with a system of Jim Crow because the North
That's right. Lost interest.
gave up on reconstructing the
That's
South.
right. Lost interest. Gave
So
up
there,
on Reconstruction.
yeah, so it may not be that there was a
No
gradual change, but that there was no clear timetable for
Yeah,
it.
no ending point, no date certain.
Right.
No time when this had to end by X date, that's it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we can compare it to deadlines for Vietnam or Afghanistan or whatever we want to, but that seems to me to have been part of the problem there.
Yeah.
And as I told you earlier, I think some people now may even be beginning to wonder if the NAACP could have taken a different tact in terms of bringing about change, perhaps emphasizing voting rights more or economic rights more instead of going at public education. And I say that because public education in the South, and I think in other parts of the country too, the public school is one of the centers of the community, and centers of the white community and of the black community under segregation. There were two centers, one for each race in effect, and it involved children. And people, I think, become very, very defensive about manipulating their children and using their children, as people in the South would have said at the time, in some kind of social experiment. And so maybe it was not the right strategy to take, or maybe it was the strategy could have included more things that could have also helped.
As you say, it should have been voting, and if you're doing work on this, it's going to be fascinating to find out what you learn and what you think after going back to the days of Charles Hamilton Houston, and even before that, as to why the NAACP chose to focus on education rather than, say, the vote. There are some reasons which could spring to mind. Nonetheless, it's an interesting question. Yes. As I understand it, the White Citizens Councils and the State Sovereignty Commission, for practical purposes, well, maybe it's too strong to say, took over the state, ran the state, had their way with anything they want, but Lord, they were powerful groups, weren't they?
Yes, they were. And many people thought at the time of the Meredith, what's called the Meredith crisis in '62, that the main advisors to Governor Barnett, who had access to him, were powerful people in the Citizens Council. Yeah. The other people in state government who were not quite that rigid and inflexible about segregation simply didn't have access to him. And so he was if not their tool, at least he was talking only to them.
Yeah. And if they had had a motto, it would have been never.
Yes, yes.
Let's talk a little bit about Meredith. Tell the audience about his life as a youngster and his years in the Air Force and so forth.
Well, he grew up on his parents' farm in Atala County, which is almost in the exact center of the state. And it's interesting that he grew up on his parents' farm. They owned their own land. His father and mother did. That in itself was unusual. And they owned...
Can I interject a
yes.
point? I'm sorry, this is very rude of me. But I have to tell you that people who study these things now are saying that the African Americans who are immensely successful in today's society, as for example, Oprah Winfrey, tend to have had great-great-grandparents who had owned their own property down south. There's something about that.
Yes.
But anyway, I interrupted you.
Either owned their own property or worked for a railroad and were members of the Brotherhood of Steaming Car Porters, and then therefore had their checks come from someone outside the local community. But it gave them a sense of financial or independence to a large extent. They could own their own home. And that tells you a lot about the kind of people that Meredith's family, Meredith's parents were. Resilient and strong, disciplined, independent, hardworking. And that's the culture he grew up in.
Right.
And that's the kind of person he became. They made sure their children went to school, and a number of their children, including Meredith, they sent off to Florida for their last year in high school to make sure they got a good last year, a good education in high school. So he comes from really an unusual personal background. One other little thing that is an indication of the kind of parents he had. His father, Moses Meredith, registered to vote in 1919. 1919, 46 years before the Voting Rights Act. He had the courage and the initiative to go to the courthouse in Kosciuszko and withstand Jim Crow, stand up to him, and register to vote.
He's probably lucky he wasn't lynched, actually.
Well, who knows? But then Meredith served in the Air Force after high school. Served in the Air Force for 8 years, and I think that was a time in which he really grew up a lot. He, as I think I said earlier, he went to school in the Air Force, a lot of training programs. He took a lot of extension courses from colleges, correspondence courses, and just became a much, well, he got older by 8 years, but mature and much more thoughtful person.
Why did he get the idea, which, you know, one could unkindly say is megalomaniacal, But on the other hand is what motivates almost all successful people, that it is his to bring it is his function in the world, his destiny, to help his people get out from under the system of white domination.
Well, I think he was brought up to think that he should be treated equally. And he could see no reason not to be. And in the Air Force, in many ways he was treated equally. And then in Japan, where he was stationed for several years, he realized that he was not treated like a black person there. He was treated as a human being, as an American. He began to see what race was not like by living in Japan. Yeah. And at the same time, he was watching the civil rights movement emerge in the United States. He was watching from a distance. And two other things that I perhaps should mention, they're in the book. At one of his review sessions in the military, when he was being reviewed by his superiors and ranked and rated for his performance, one of the officers urged him when he went back to Mississippi to change things, a white officer. And so, you know, he begins to realize this is something that had to be done.
Yeah. He was a very conservative individual, actually. He was not like what you might call the norm of the African-American civil rights writer of the time.
No, he wasn't. He was, from the beginning, financially very responsible, very frugal, saving money, investing in land in Atala County when he was in the service, supporting his parents. He really did believe in his own responsibility for his own success. And the whole idea of bootstraps, he believed in that.
Yeah. A Booker T. Washington type of mentality.
Yes.
When he
combined with the belief that he was supposed to be in an elite. Yes. And supposed to be educated. And he was in Du Bois's talented 10th at the same time that he was pulling himself up through self-improvement, the way Washington did.
Right. The university tried every trick it could to keep him out. And we're not going to get into the riot because we don't have time. And a riot is a riot is a riot. A couple of people got killed. The Army had to be called in, and you know, it was chaos. But first, the university made it almost impossible for him to get in. And then when federal judges finally forced the issue, thanks be to God, life was made hell for him on campus. We have about 40 seconds. Maybe you can describe a little bit the way life was made hell for him on campus.
Well, he was isolated, to say the least. And I think one newspaper said he was the most segregated Negro in America, or something like that, on campus. He was surrounded or accompanied by federal agents at all times, and he had relatively little interaction with any other students, and faced all kinds of harassment and torment. Students moving furniture around over in the room above him all during the night to keep him awake, to throwing rocks and bottles and firecrackers at him and water bombs and so on. It took the same endurance and the same resilience to survive that year it did to get in the university to start with.
Now, in the last 20 seconds, a few years ago, a memorial was erected to Meredith on the campus, and he attended some of the proceedings. And you believe that it does not do him justice because it leaves out some of his most salient thoughts.
Well, I think a couple of things are left out. Nowhere in the monument or the memorial does it say he was an African American or black or colored or Negro. In no way does it identify his race. And it does not. There are 4 words on the monument there, and I can't remember them, but forbearance or anyway. The words are not the words associated with the civil rights movement, and I think that's unfortunate. Yeah. Equality and civil rights and those kinds of things.
As I remember it, they quoted from his book, and in the quotes they left out the most salient parts. That you know, he talked about how he loves walking back through Mississippi and didn't put in that there's fear every minute.
Yes, and what he liked about Mississippi was the land, not the government.
Yeah. Well, thank you. A real contribution to some of the unfortunate history of this country. Appreciate you coming up.
Thank you.
Oxford. To the audience, thank you for being with us, and be with us again next time for the next installment of Books of Our Time.